Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and today we're going to do 2 square spiral designs that can easily be done with your walking foot. These are Wonky Square Spiral and Spiral Maze. Now, the step-by-step instructions for both can be found in my book, 99 Machine Quilting Designs. I'm going to sketch out both of them on a practice sample, and I'm going to use a couple tools to make the job easier. So if you have painter's tape and a regular ruler that you can put next to your foot, that can help you out. So grab your materials, give it a try, and let me know what you think. Both of these square spiral designs can be found in my book. Wonky Square Spirals is design number 24, and Spiral Maze is number 25. For my Wonky Square Spiral, I'm going to start by stitching in the ditch on all 4 sides around whatever block or area I'm going to quilt. Then I'm going to stitch a relatively straight line across to the opposite side, and I'm going to touch 3 times. Then as I come back through, I'm not going to touch anymore, but I'm basically spiraling back in, keeping a relatively square shape, but I'm not trying to line anything up. I just want these designs to be relatively straight. So that's one version of what you can do. Another version is, rather than starting with straight lines, you can go ahead and start with wavy lines all the way up and across. And this can just be kind of eyeballed, but the idea, again, you touch 1, touch 2, touch 3, then no more touchy-touchy, come all the way down. And when you end, you want to lock your stitches, or you can tie them off so they're nice and secure. So this Wonky Square Spiral design can be either quilted using free motion techniques or using your walking foot or dual feed, which is what you're seeing me do right now. I personally think it's a lot easier to do with walking foot techniques, so I don't mind turning the quilt a lot as I stitch. Now you'll notice as I'm quilting, I'm using a piece of painter's tape to keep the lines nice and straight. The edge of my foot is right next to the piece of tape so that the actual line I'm stitching is somewhere between 3/8 or maybe ½ inch away from the tape, depending on my needle position. You can definitely change your needle position to make it closer or wider, and you can even stitch right next to the tape. You just want to make sure you do that nice and slow so that you don't end up stitching the tape. So as I'm stitching, I'm going from one edge of the square to the other, and I'm only going to touch a total of 3 sides of the square. Then I'm going to randomly stop within the design so that it appears a little bit more random and whimsical. I'll stitch to the edge of the square and rotate, then lift the tape and reposition it to stitch the next straight line. So this practice block basically represents one block of my quilt. Now I can quilt a larger full-scale design across the whole quilt if I wanted to, but I prefer to stitch this design just one block at a time. It's easier to manage the quilt that way, and it gives me lots of texture and interest to my quilt. So as I'm stitching the lines, you can see that they're all kind of random, and you can decide how closely or widely spaced you want your stitching lines to be. Some areas are going to leave more open space and others are going to be a little tighter together. But again, it's going for that random, irregular look. So just place your tape accordingly as you go. Now, if you don't want to use painter's tape, you can mark the lines ahead of time, or you can just eyeball them for a more random, organic look. I kind of use that term a lot, but you can really see that I lean into that style of design. As I mentioned in the book and also in my sketching practice, you can quilt these with wiggly lines instead, or you can even combine straight and wavy lines in the same sample. Although I'm using the tape to keep my lines straight, I'm not measuring out any of the spacing because, again, I really like that irregular look. If some of your spaced areas are a little too wide, you can always go back in and add more quilting later, or you can fill in some of those areas with a free motion design just to give it a little bit more variety. I'm going to keep using this same piece of tape until it loses its stickiness, and usually I can quilt at least a block or 2 before I need to get a new piece of tape. Eventually, I can just eyeball the straight lines when they're short enough and keep on going. So I'm going to quilt this design spiraling in, kind of representing a square until it looks finished, and then I'm going to lock my threads at the end to secure them. My favorite way to do this is to give the quilt a little resistance by holding it in place while stitching about 6 to 10 teeny tiny stitches. This design is really quick to stitch and is especially good when you're in a hurry to get something done. Here's Wonky Square Spiral all stitched out. Like the other spiral designs, you can do them on one block or an entire quilt. Spiral Maze is very similar to the Wonky Square Spiral that I showed you previously, where I'm going to start by stitching in the ditch around all four sides and then stitching straight lines on the opposite angles. However, I'm going to touch every single time. And what happens is I sketch out these lines is it creates this really cool design that almost looks like a spiral staircase looking down. But notice that I'm not measuring anything. This is all completely random, but your eye really loves to find this pattern. So I'm going to keep going until I feel like I'm done, and then I usually stop with the triangle and I lock my threads. Now I can also show you what this looks like if you do wavy lines instead, because one thing to remember is any walking foot quilting design that you do can be quilted with a straight line or a wavy line or even a decorative stitch. I give a lot of examples in the book, plus I mention some variations that you can also try where I just mention it but don't necessarily give an image. So it's really fun to just keep going. It's always going to look different no matter what until you feel like it's done, and I really like how that looks. Spiral Maze starts out the exact same way as I just showed you with the Wonky Square Spiral. I'm still quilting with a walking foot, or in my case the dual feed, and I'm aiming for nice straight lines as I stitch. My feed dogs are up or engaged, and I'm stitching with a longer stitch length. On my machine, that's 3.0 millimeters instead of the default of 2.5. That little bit of a longer stitch helps compensate for any friction or drag on the quilt, which tends to shorten up your stitches. But rather than using painter's tape, on this sample, I wanted to show you another version of how you can get those straight lines. You can use a straight edge or a quilting ruler to stitch against instead. You'll just want to be careful and go slow so that the ruler does not slip under your foot as you stitch. But this is an easy way to keep your lines straight without having to mark them. I'm using a shorter ruler so that it's easy to handle, but understand this is a completely different technique from what's known as quote unquote free motion quilting ruler work. That's a different animal altogether. With this design that I'm doing, you could even use a regular rotary cutting ruler as long as you keep it right next to the edge of your foot so it doesn't slip. As I stitch this spiral maze, I'm going to stitch a line around the square until I reach a point on the edge of the opposite line. I will touch a side each and every time that I stitch a new line, but I'm not spacing them out evenly. It's still going for that random little bit of wonky look. However, the more lines that I stitch, the more the pattern begins to appear. It's quite a bit of turning, but each time I rotate, I stop with my needle in the down position and then move my sample or quilt. Some other ideas to try with this design are quilting wavy lines instead of straight ones, or you can touch some of the edges and not touch others just to change up the design a bit. Remember, if you can think it or sketch it, you can definitely stitch it. I call this a maze design because it kind of looks like you could get lost in a maze, or maybe it looks like a spiral staircase, but it really ends up looking cool. And most of my students who try out this one and the wonky design, they prefer this one because your eye really kind of notices that pattern, even though the lines are all irregular. Now, one thing that helps is that my machine has what's called a hover feature, where the foot will raise up slightly once I stop stitching. You can use a hands-free knee lift to do the same thing, or you can just do it the regular old-fashioned way and manually raise your presser foot each time you need to stop and rotate your quilt. So I'll continue stitching this out until I feel like the design is finished. Then I'll end with a few tiny stitches to lock it in place and cut thread on both sides of the quilt. This is my completed spiral maze. It's similar to Wonky Square Spiral, but with more of a twist. This quilt behind me is called Bling, and it's made from my Dazzle Dots fabrics. Now, this is one of my most popular patterns because the layouts are really infinite with what you can do. Because I made this quilt several different times, I wanted to try out a different quilting plan when I made this version. So basically what I did is I quilted the Wonky Square Spirals with a wavy line in every other block, and then I quilted the continuous round spiral in every other block. But before I did that, first of all, I stitched in the ditch in the vertical vertical and the horizontal seams so that I could hold the quilt together before I added the spirals. Now these spirals are really fun to do and they're very forgiving, but they do require a lot of turning of the quilt. So if you just know that going into it, you're gonna have a really good time with it. Now another quilt I wanna show you where I use the Wonky square spiral is called Square in a Square. The pattern for this one is from the first book I ever wrote called Machine Quilting with Style. On this version, I wanted to quilt the Wonky square spirals in the blocks, and then I filled in the background areas with a fun free motion square design as well. That way I can custom quilt by using both walking foot and free motion techniques. So you know what? As you work your way through all of these practice designs, start thinking about how you can combine walking foot quilting with free motion quilting, how you can tweak designs and make them your own. It's really fun to do, and the best way to practice is making them on regular full-size quilts. So be sure to check the description box for links to everything I mentioned, plus some bonus videos and where you can get all of my books, patterns, and fabrics if you want to make the quilts just like me. I hope you're enjoying this series, and make sure to leave comments and questions as well. I read them and they really make my day when you're having fun with these videos. I'll catch you in the next one.